The blood was the first thing she saw, a dark, frozen smear against the pale, splintered wood of the cabin floor. It was a stain that defied the scrubbing brush, a ghost that clung to the grain long after her husband, Thomas, had been lowered into the unforgiving earth. Alara traced its shape with her eyes, a familiar ritual of grief and suspicion. The official story was a logging accident, a falling widowmaker that had crushed him instantly. But the men who brought him back, their faces a mixture of pity and something colder, had been too quick with their story, too eager to leave. And they had never explained the blood inside the cabin. A gust of wind, sharp as shattered glass, rattled the single window pane, and Alara flinched. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, the color of a bruised iron skillet. Snow was coming, not the gentle, blanketing kind, but a blizzard, the sort the old-timers spoke of with a shiver in their voice, the kind that buried grievances and secrets alike under a shroud of white. Her gaze drifted from the stain to her younger sister, Lily, who slept curled on the thin mattress in the corner, her breath a quiet puff in the frigid air. Lily was all she had left, a fragile flame in the encroaching dark. Protecting her was the only thought that gave Alara's limbs the strength to move, her lungs the will to draw another icy breath. The debt was a tightening noose. After Thomas's death, Silas Blackwood had materialized like a vulture drawn to a carcass. He owned the town of Redemption Gap, the saloon, the general store, the bank, and the men who wore tin stars on their chests. He had produced a stack of papers, Thomas's familiar, looping signature at the bottom of each one, detailing a debt that was staggering, impossible. A debt for this very plot of land, this small, defensible pocket in the unforgiving maw of the Obsidian Peaks. Blackwood, with his tailored wool coats and his smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes, had made her an offer, a proposition that felt more like a threat. He spoke of her vulnerability, of the harsh winter, of the impossibility of a lone woman and a child surviving. He spoke of her virtue as if it were another commodity to be bartered. Every word he uttered was coated in a sickening sweetness that failed to mask the rot beneath. She had refused him. The memory of her own defiance was a small, hot coal in the pit of her stomach. She had seen the flash of fury in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. It was the look of a man used to being denied, a civilized tyrant whose power was absolute in his small, miserable kingdom. His departure had not felt like a victory, but like the quiet before a rockslide. Now, the consequences of that defiance were coming due. A notice had been nailed to her door 2 days ago, a formal, cruel summons. The town council, which was to say Silas Blackwood and his cronies, would be convening to discuss her situation, her indebtedness, the disposition of her property. It was a public flaying disguised as civic duty. The wind shrieked like a tortured soul, and Lily stirred in her sleep, a small whimper escaping her lips. Alara moved to her side, pulling the threadbare quilt higher around her sister's shoulders. The child's face, so much like their mother's, was pale and thin. They were down half a sack of flour, a few dried beans, and the dwindling pile of firewood Thomas had chopped before. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a struggle. She felt trapped, a fox with its leg in a steel jaw, the hunter approaching with a glint in his eye. She looked around the small, one-room cabin that had been her home, her prison, and now felt like her tomb. The rough-hewn walls seemed to be closing in. She walked back to the center of the room, her worn boots silent on the floorboards. She stood over the stain again, that dark, ugly question mark on the floor. An accident, they said, but Silas Blackwood had wanted this land for years, had made Thomas offers that bordered on threats. The spring that ran through their property was the only one on this side of the mountain that never froze, a vital resource he coveted for his expanding timber operations. Thomas had always refused to sell. The thought was a venomous seed, planting itself in the fertile ground of her fear. What if it wasn't an accident? What if the stain on the floor was not from a wound sustained in the forest, but from one delivered right here? What if the men who brought him home were not rescuers, but accomplices? The cold that seeped into her bones had nothing to do with the coming storm. It was the chilling realization of her own powerlessness, the dawning horror that the monster was not some beast lurking in the woods, but the man who smiled at her in the street, the man who held the town in his fist, the man who was about to take everything she had left. She had to go to the meeting. She had to face them. She had no choice. But as she pulled on her threadbare coat, the wind howled a lament, and Alara felt as if she were walking not to the town hall, but to her own execution. The air in the town hall was thick with the smells of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and self-righteousness. It was a small, suffocating space, made smaller by the crush of bodies. Every man in Redemption Gap seemed to be there, their faces grim or curious, or, in the case of Silas Blackwood's hired guns, openly contemptuous. Alara stood before them, Lily's small, cold hand clutched tightly in her own. She had left her sister with a kindly but timid baker's wife at first, but Lily had cried with such terror that Alara couldn't bear it. She had brought her along, a tiny, silent accusation against the assembled men. Let them see what they were doing. Let them look into the face of the child whose home they were about to steal. Silas Blackwood sat at the head of the long table, a king on a makeshift throne. He presided over the proceedings with an air of bored authority, his fingers steepled before him, a gold ring glinting in the lantern light. Alara, he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. We are all gathered here today out of concern for your welfare, and that of your sister. He gestured vaguely toward Lily, a magnanimous lord acknowledging a peasant. Alara said nothing. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and unspoken fury. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder, a crack in the plaster that looked like a lightning bolt. Your late husband, Thomas, was a good man, Blackwood continued, the lie dripping from his tongue. But not, it seems, a prudent one. He has left you with a significant debt. A debt to the bank. My bank. A murmur went through the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, stripping her bare. She was no longer Alara, their neighbor. She was the widow, the debtor, the problem to be solved. This property, Blackwood went on, tapping a sheaf of papers, is forfeit. The law is quite clear. The law is what you say it is. Alara's voice was a raw whisper, but in the sudden silence, it carried like a shout. Blackwood's smile tightened. The law, my dear, is the bedrock of civilization. And here in Redemption Gap, we are civilized men. A few of his cronies chuckled. However, he said, raising a hand for silence, I am not without compassion. To cast a grieving widow and a child out into a blizzard, it would be an act of cruelty. Hope, a treacherous and foolish thing, flickered in Alara's chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe he might show mercy. Therefore, Blackwood announced, his voice booming with false generosity, the town council and I have devised a creative solution, a way for you to retain a roof over your head and for your debt to be managed. He paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. He was a showman, and this was his stage. There is another man in these parts with a claim to land, a man living outside the bounds of our community, a man who requires a civilizing influence. A nervous, excited titter ran through the room. Alara's stomach turned to ice. She knew who he meant. Everyone knew. The man who lived on the highest, most inhospitable peak of the Obsidian Range. A ghost story told to frighten children. The Mountain Man. It is not proper for a woman to live alone, Blackwood declared, his eyes glinting with a truly venomous malice. Therefore, we have decided to grant you a new protector. We are giving you in marriage. The room erupted, not in outrage, but in a wave of cruel, braying laughter. The sound hit Alara like a physical blow. They were laughing at her humiliation, at the sheer, calculated cruelty of it. To whom? She choked out, though she already knew. Blackwood's smile was a triumphant slash in his face. To Caleb, the hermit of Obsidian Peak. It is a fitting match, I think. The bankrupt widow and the broken recluse. The town has agreed to forgive your debt as a wedding gift. You will be his burden now, not ours. The humiliation was complete. It was a death sentence disguised as a wedding vow. Caleb. No one even knew if that was his real name. He was a monster, a myth. They said he'd fought with grizzlies and won. They said he was a deserter, a madman. They said he had one leg, having lost the other to a trap, or a cannonball, or the devil himself. To give her to him was not an act of mercy. It was an act of profound spite, a way to dispose of her and seize her land without getting his own hands dirty. She would freeze or starve or be murdered in that high, lonely place, and no one would ever know. You can't, she whispered, shaking her head, the world tilting on its axis. It is done, Blackwood said with an air of finality. He banged a gavel on the table. By the authority vested in me by this council, I pronounce you betrothed. The parson will make it official, and your groom is already on his way. As if on cue, the doors to the town hall burst open. A blast of wind and snow swirled into the room, extinguishing half the lanterns and plunging the space into a chaos of shadows. Two of Blackwood's largest thugs stood there, dragging a third man between them. He was immense, taller than anyone in the room, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle. His hair was a wild, black mane, and his beard was thick and unkempt. His face was a road map of scars, the most prominent a jagged line that pulled one corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He was dressed in furs and buckskin, patched and worn. But it was his eyes that held Alara captive. They were the color of a winter sky before a storm, a piercing, pale gray that burned with a cold, contained fury. And he moved with a strange, jarring rhythm. One leg, clad in a sturdy leather boot, stepped forward. The other followed with a heavy, wooden thud, a crudely carved prosthetic, strapped to his thigh with thick leather cords. This was Caleb, the mountain man, her husband. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Blackwood. His gaze swept the room and landed on Alara, and for a heart-stopping second, she felt seen. Not as a widow, not as a debtor, but as a fellow creature in a trap. The laughter in the room died in men's throats. The monster of their stories was real, and he was more terrifying and somehow more noble than they had ever imagined. Caleb's eyes narrowed, taking in her threadbare coat, her terrified face, the small child hiding behind her skirts. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with Blackwood's petty theatrics. This was something older, more primal. He was a cornered grizzly, a wounded wolf, and Silas Blackwood, in his arrogance, had just thrown a helpless lamb into his den. The journey to Obsidian Peak was a silent, grim procession through a world turning to white. Caleb led the way, his strange, uneven gait eating up the ground with a deceptive speed. He had not spoken a word since the mockery of ceremony in the town hall, where a trembling parson had mumbled a few holy words that felt like a curse. Caleb had simply fixed his storm-gray eyes on Alara, given a single, sharp nod, and turned towards the mountain. Alara followed, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She carried Lily, who had fallen into an exhausted, fretful sleep, her small body a leaden weight in Alara's arms. The wind was a physical force, tearing at her coat, stinging her cheeks with ice crystals, and trying to rip the very breath from her lungs. The path, barely visible, climbed relentlessly, a treacherous ribbon of rock and ice winding its way into the clouds. She watched the man ahead of her. He moved with a savage grace that belied his injury. The wooden leg, which had seemed a mark of weakness in the town hall, was a tool of survival up here. He used it as an anchor on icy patches, a brace against the wind's assault. He was part of this brutal landscape, shaped by it, as hard and unforgiving as the granite that formed the mountain's bones. He was an apex predator in his natural habitat, and she was a soft, civilized creature utterly out of her depth. Fear was a constant companion, a cold sweat on her skin despite the freezing air. What kind of man was this? What awaited her and Lily in his lair at the top of the world? The town's cruelty had been a known quantity, a familiar evil. This was a terrifying unknown. Every story she had ever heard about him swirled in her mind. Madman, killer, beast. They climbed for what felt like an eternity. The sun was a pale, forgotten memory, and the world was a swirling vortex of gray and white. Alara's muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned. The cold was a deep, invasive thing, seeping into her bones. Several times, her foot slipped and she nearly fell. Each time, she caught herself, driven by the primal need to protect the child in her arms. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that she would simply collapse and let the snow claim them, he stopped. He had paused on a narrow ledge, his back to her, a dark, imposing silhouette against the blizzard's fury. He stood motionless for a long moment, as if listening to the mountain's heartbeat. Then, without turning, he spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. "Give me the child." It was not a question. It was a command. Panic, sharp and blinding, seized Alara. Her arms tightened instinctively around Lily. This was it. The monster was showing his true face. He would take her child, and what? Her mind recoiled from the possibilities. "No," she breathed, the word lost in the wind. He heard her. He turned, and the full force of the storm seemed to be concentrated in his gaze. He took a step towards her, his prosthetic leg thudding heavily on the stone. He was so much bigger up close, a mountain of fur and muscle and quiet rage. "You are failing," he stated, a simple, brutal fact. He gestured with his chin at her trembling legs, at the way she swayed on her feet. "The child is cold. You will fall. Give her to me." Alara shook her head, a desperate, mute denial. She took a stumbling step backward, her heel finding only empty air at the edge of the precipice. For a terrifying second, she teetered, the world tilting into a white abyss. A scream tore from her throat, but before she could fall, a hand shot out, grabbing the front of her coat. It was not a gentle grasp. It was a grip of iron, hauling her forward, away from the edge, with a strength that was shocking. He pulled her so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of pine and wood smoke and cold, clean air that clung to him. His face was inches from hers, his eyes boring into her, stripping away her fear and defiance, seeing the raw terror beneath. He did not shout. He did not threaten. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but it held an authority that was absolute. "I will not harm her," he said, "or you, but we will all die on this mountain if you do not trust me. Now, give me the child." Something in his eyes, a flicker of, not gentleness, but a profound weariness, a deep-seated honor, broke through her panic. He was not the monster from the stories. He was something far more complex and far more dangerous, but perhaps not to her. Slowly, her arms trembling with exhaustion and fear, Alara transferred Lily's sleeping form into his. Caleb took the child with a surprising ease. His large, scarred hands, which looked capable of snapping a man's neck, were impossibly gentle as he adjusted Lily in his arms. He shrugged off the outer layer of his furs, a massive bearskin cloak, and wrapped it around the child, cocooning her in its warmth. Lily, who would scream if a stranger so much as looked at her, merely snuggled deeper into the warmth, her face pressed against the rough buckskin of his shirt. Without another word, Caleb turned and continued his ascent, carrying the child as if she weighed nothing at all. He moved more slowly now, shielding her small body from the worst of the wind with his own. Alara followed, her limbs numb, her mind reeling. She was no longer carrying Lily, but her own burden of fear had been replaced by a new, bewildering feeling. In that single, stark moment on the ledge, a transfer had occurred. Silas Blackwood had tried to make her this man's burden. Instead, Caleb had taken up hers. The cabin was almost invisible until they were upon it, a low, dark shape hunkered down against the mountainside, half buried in snow. It was built of massive, dark-hewn logs, with a roof pitched so steeply the snow could find no purchase. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile sign of life in the desolate wilderness. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Caleb pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, gesturing for Alara to follow. The air within was warm and smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, something clean and wild. It was a single, large room, dominated by a huge stone fireplace where a low fire crackled merrily. The space was Spartan but meticulously organized. Furs were piled neatly on a raised sleeping platform. Tools hung in precise order on the walls. Axes, knives of varying sizes, a long rifle, and a collection of traps. Bunches of dried herbs and roots hung from the rafters. There was a rough-hewn table and 2 stools. It was the den of a solitary creature, a place built for function and survival, not comfort. Caleb crossed the room and gently laid the still sleeping Lily on the bed of furs. He covered her with a soft, thick wolf pelt, his movements deliberate and careful. He was a man of few, efficient motions, nothing wasted. Alara stood hesitantly by the door, dripping melted snow onto the floor, feeling like an intruder. This was his space, his sanctuary. She and Lily were a violation, an unwanted intrusion of the soft, messy world he had so clearly abandoned. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Caleb stood with his back to her, staring into the flames. He seemed to have forgotten she was there. Alara's fear began to creep back in, colder and sharper in the warm room. She had survived the mountain. Now she had to survive the man. She cleared her throat. The small sound was shockingly loud. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse, "for carrying her." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes still fixed on the fire. He moved to the hearth, adding another log to the flames. Sparks flew up the chimney like a flurry of angry fireflies. He was a creature of the fire, of the mountain, a being of elemental forces she could not hope to understand. He finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask carved from granite. "There is stew," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured with his chin towards a black pot simmering on the hearth. "Eat, then sleep. The storm will last for days." It was not an invitation, but a directive. He was a man who dealt in necessities: warmth, food, shelter. He had provided them. The rest was an unknown territory. Alara ladled some of the stew into a wooden bowl. It was thick with meat she couldn't identify and root vegetables. It was hot and savory, and she realized she was ravenous. She sat on one of the stools, as far from him as possible, and ate in silence, acutely aware of his presence. He did not eat. He stood by the window, a dark shadow looking out at the white fury of the storm, a guardian at the edge of the world. She finished her stew and cleaned her bowl, her movements small and quiet. She felt a desperate need to be invisible, to not disturb the delicate, dangerous peace of this den. She looked at Lily, sleeping soundly in the warm nest of furs, and then at the imposing figure of the man who was now, by some cruel twist of fate, her husband. He had saved them on the mountain. He had given them food and shelter. But his silence was a wall, his stillness a threat. The initial terror had subsided, replaced by a wary, exhausting tension. She was a prisoner here, not of bars and chains, but of the blizzard and the vast, untamed wilderness outside. And her jailer was a silent, scarred giant with the eyes of a wolf and a past shrouded in mystery and fear. The night passed in a state of suspended animation. Alara did not sleep. She lay on a pile of furs Caleb had indicated for her on the floor near the hearth, every muscle tight, listening. She listened to the storm rage against the cabin walls, a wild beast trying to claw its way in. She listened to the steady, quiet breathing of her sister, a sound that anchored her to reality. And she listened to the silence of the man across the room. Caleb had not gone to the sleeping platform with Lily. Instead, he had settled onto the floor by the door, his back against the wall, the long rifle laid across his lap. He sat as still as the stones in his fireplace, a sentinel on his self-imposed watch. Whether he was guarding the cabin from the storm or guarding its new occupant from himself, Alara could not tell. At some point, she must have drifted off, because she was startled awake by a soft touch on her shoulder. Her eyes flew open, her body instantly rigid with fear. Caleb was kneeling beside her, a dark shape in the pre-dawn gloom. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows. His face was close, his expression unreadable in the dim light. A scream caught in her throat. "The child," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. "She is crying." Alara's panic receded, replaced by maternal instinct. She scrambled to her feet and rushed to the sleeping platform. Lily was awake, her small body trembling, her face tear-streaked. She wasn't crying loudly, just making small, terrified whimpering sounds. "Little bird, I'm here," Alara cooed, gathering her into her arms. "It was just a bad dream." Lily clung to her, burying her face in Alara's neck. "The monster, Alara." There was a monster. Alara's heart clenched. She shot a glance over her shoulder. Caleb had retreated to the far side of the room, near the fireplace, but she could feel his presence, a heavy weight in the small space. Was he the monster from Lily's dream? "There are no monsters here, sweet girl," Alara whispered, rocking her gently. "You're safe." "We're safe." It was a lie, but one she desperately needed to believe. Lily's whimper subsided, but she still trembled. "I'm cold," she whispered. Before Alara could reply, there was a soft thud beside them. Caleb had placed a steaming mug on the floor next to the bed. He hadn't approached them directly, but had circled around, keeping his distance, as if he understood he was a frightening figure. He then retreated back to the hearth without a word. Alara hesitated, then picked up the mug. It was warm in her hands. Steam rose from it, carrying the sweet, fragrant scent of chamomile and honey. She looked over at him, a silent question in her eyes. He was stoking the embers of the fire, his broad back to her, but she knew he was aware of her gaze. "For the child," he rumbled, not turning around. "It will soothe her." Carefully, Alara held the mug to Lily's lips. "There, little bird. Try this. It's warm." Lily took a tentative sip, then another. A little color returned to her pale cheeks. The trembling began to subside. Alara continued to hold her, murmuring soft reassurances, until the child's breathing evened out and she drifted back to sleep, the half-empty mug of tea still clutched in her small hands. Alara gently laid her back down, tucking the wolf pelt around her. She stood for a moment, watching her sister sleep, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Then she turned her attention to the man by the fire. This was the pivotal moment, though she did not know it at the time. It was not a grand gesture, not a dramatic speech. It was a simple cup of herbal tea. It was the act of a man who had recognized a child's distress and had known, from his own store of wilderness knowledge, exactly what would calm her. It was the act of a man who had taken care to not frighten them further, who had offered his help from a distance, respecting their fear of him. It was an act of unexpected, unspoken gentleness. The wall of terror she had built around her heart developed a small, hairline crack. The monster of her imagination, the brutal savage from the town stories, would not have known about chamomile tea. He would not have shown such quiet consideration. She walked over to the hearth, her steps no longer timid but deliberate. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes wary. He was like a wild animal, accustomed to solitude, startled by her proximity. She stopped a few feet away, not wanting to crowd him. "Thank you," she said again, and this time, the words were not just for carrying Lily up the mountain. They were for the tea, for the unspoken understanding. He gave that same, small, frustratingly unreadable nod. He turned his attention back to the fire, as if dismissing her. But Alara did not retreat this time. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of the silence. If she was to survive in this den, she needed to understand the beast she shared it with. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He stilled, the poker in his hand hovering over the coals. He turned his head just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. "Why what? Why did you agree to this?" "To me?" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire farce of their marriage. "Blackwood did this to humiliate me. But he humiliated you too. Why did you let him?" For a long time, he was silent. The only sound was the fire and the wind. She thought he would not answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, a sound of profound and ancient weariness. He turned to face her fully, leaning his shoulders against the rough stone of the mantelpiece. The firelight played across the scars on his face, making them seem deeper, more tragic. "Blackwood doesn't own me," he said, his voice low and flat. "His games mean nothing up here." He looked around the cabin, at his small, self-contained world. "But he owns the town. He owns the supply store. I need salt. I need powder. Once a year I go down. This year, he was waiting for me. He offered me a deal." "A deal?" Alara asked, confused. "He told me about the debt. He told me he was going to take your land and turn you and the child out into the storm. He presented it as a choice." Caleb's mouth twisted into a bitter line that had nothing to do with his scar. "He said I could have a winter's worth of supplies, no questions asked. All I had to do was take his problem off his hands. Take you." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture even uglier than she had imagined. Blackwood hadn't just been getting rid of her. He had been buying Caleb's complicity, trying to dirty him, to make him a partner in his cruelty. "He thought I would let you freeze on the path up here," Caleb continued, his voice dropping even lower. "He thought I would use you. And when you were gone, he would have the land, and my hands would be as filthy as his. He thought to own me, same as he owns everyone else. So why did you do it?" Alara pressed, her heart hammering. "Why did you take the deal?" He finally met her gaze, and the cold fury in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. "I did not take his deal," he growled, the sound a primal vibration in his chest. "I looked at him sitting there in his fine coat, with his soft hands, and I saw the rot in him. And then I looked at you, standing there with your chin up, terrified but not broken, with that little one hiding behind you. And I saw what he was trying to crush." He pushed himself off the mantelpiece, his immense frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. "I did not agree to his terms. I made my own. I told him I would take you and the child. I would give you my name and my protection. In return, he would cancel the debt. Not manage it. Cancel it. And he would leave you and your land alone. Forever." Alara stared at him, speechless. This changed everything. He hadn't been a pawn in Blackwood's game. He had been a player. He had walked into that hall, seen the board, and made his own move. He had used Blackwood's own cruelty against him. "He agreed," she whispered, incredulous. He laughed. Caleb said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "He thinks he won. He thinks he has saddled me with a burden that will destroy me. He thinks by spring he will find our bones and claim this mountain for himself. He is a fool. He understands force, but he does not understand strength." He took a step closer, and for the first time, Alara did not shrink away. "I gave you my name, Alara. On this mountain, that means something. It means you are under my protection. You and the child. No one will harm you here. Not Blackwood. Not the storm. Not me." The last two words hung in the air between them, a solemn vow. The crack in the wall around Alara's heart shattered, and a warmth she had not felt in years spread through her chest. It was not love, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was trust. In the heart of the blizzard, in the den of the mountain man, she was not a prisoner. She was, for the first time since Thomas's death, safe. The days that followed were a quiet unfolding. The blizzard, as Caleb had predicted, raged on, sealing them in their mountain fortress, a world of wood and stone and fire suspended in a universe of swirling white. The tension in the cabin did not vanish, but it transformed. The sharp edges of fear and suspicion were worn down by the slow, steady rhythm of shared survival, replaced by a quiet, watchful curiosity. They fell into a routine dictated by necessity. Caleb was the first to rise, moving with a quiet economy in the pre-dawn gloom to stoke the fire and put a pot of water on to boil for tea or a thin porridge. Alara would wake soon after, her body no longer rigid with alarm at his presence. She would tend to Lily, her own movements becoming as quiet and deliberate as his, a silent acknowledgement of the smallness of their shared space. They did not speak much. Words seemed extraneous, clumsy things in the face of the storm's constant roar. Their communication was a language of gestures and shared tasks. When the woodbox ran low, Alara would put on her coat. Caleb would simply nod and hand her the smaller axe, having already cleared a path to the sheltered woodpile against the cabin's leeward wall. She would return, cheeks pink from the cold, with an armload of split pine, and he would take it from her without a word, his scarred fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, a spark of warmth in the freezing air. She learned about him in the details. She saw the way he mended a tear in his buckskin shirt with a surgeon's precision, his large, powerful hands surprisingly deft with a needle and thread. She watched him spend an entire afternoon meticulously sharpening his collection of knives, each one a gleaming instrument of purpose, until they could shave the hair from his arm. She saw the way he would pause in his work and listen to the wind, his head cocked, as if deciphering a message only he could understand. He was a man who lived in a state of constant, quiet vigilance. He, in turn, learned about her. He saw the way she could make a meal out of almost nothing, stretching their meager supplies with a quiet ingenuity. He watched her talk to Lily, her voice a soft, gentle murmur that cut through the howl of the storm. He noticed the way she never let the fire die down, how she kept their small haven of warmth and light secure against the encroaching cold and dark. He saw in her resilience that mirrored the mountain itself, a strength that had been bent but not broken. The most profound connection, however, was forged through Lily. The child, after her initial terror, seemed to accept this strange, large man as a new and interesting feature of her landscape, like the fireplace or the snow. She was not afraid of his silence, and she seemed to sense the deep well of gentleness he kept so carefully hidden. One afternoon, Lily sat at the rough-hewn table, trying to draw on a piece of birch bark with a charred stick. Frustrated, she threw the stick down. "It's just a black smudge," she complained. Caleb, who had been oiling his rifle in the corner, rose from his stool. Alara tensed, but he did not approach the child directly. He walked to a small, carved chest in the corner, a chest Alara had assumed held ammunition or tools. He rummaged inside and returned, placing a small, smooth piece of wood and a wicked-looking carving knife on the table, a careful distance from Lily. He sat on the other stool and, without a word, began to carve. Alara watched, mesmerized. His hands, which she had seen split logs and sharpen blades, moved with an artist's grace. Shavings of pale wood fell to the table like snowflakes. Slowly, a shape began to emerge. A small bird, its head cocked, its wings half-furled. He worked in complete silence, his concentration absolute. Lily watched, her eyes wide, her chin resting on her hands. When he was finished, he spent a long time sanding the figure with a piece of worn leather until it was as smooth as a river stone. He held it up, examined it from all angles, and then slid it across the table towards the child. Lily picked it up, her small fingers tracing the delicate lines of the wings, the tiny, perfect beak. A slow smile spread across her face. "A little bird," she whispered, her voice full of awe. She looked up at Caleb, a direct, unblinking gaze of pure, childish gratitude. "Thank you," she said. Caleb just nodded, that same small, almost imperceptible gesture. But Alara saw it. She saw the way the tight lines around his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. She saw the way he watched Lily cradle the wooden bird to her chest, as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. In that moment, he was not the mountain man, not the hermit or the savage. He was just a man who had shared a small piece of his soul with a child. That night, after Lily was asleep, the silence felt different. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space, a comfortable quiet. They sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. "You're good with her," Alara said softly. Caleb shrugged, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I understand small, quiet things." The confession, so simple and so revealing, hung in the air. He was a man who had retreated from the loud, complicated world of men to a place of quiet simplicity. "Where did you learn to carve like that?" she asked, wanting to keep him talking, to learn more of the man behind the myth. He was silent for a long time, and she thought he would retreat back into his shell. But then he spoke, his voice a low murmur. "My father taught me, before the war." The words, "the war," landed with a heavy thud. It was a door to a past he clearly kept locked and barred. "In your leg?" The question was out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too invasive. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "You don't have to." "It's a fair question," he interrupted, his voice devoid of self-pity. He looked down at his right leg, stretched out before him. The firelight glinted off the worn leather straps that held the wooden prosthetic in place. Not a bear trap, like the stories say. Not the devil. Just a piece of hot iron from a cannon at Gettysburg. He spoke of it as if it were a historical fact, an event that had happened to someone else. But Alara could see the phantom pain flicker in his eyes, the memory of a younger man lying broken on a battlefield far from any mountain. "I was a scout," he continued, his voice taking on a distant quality, as if he were narrating a dream. "Good at moving quiet, good at seeing what others missed. But I wasn't quiet enough that day." He fell silent, lost in the memory. Now, it was her turn to share a piece of her own brokenness. "The stain on my cabin floor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was blood. They said Thomas died in the woods, but the blood was inside." Caleb's gaze snapped from a fire to her face. The distant, haunted look was gone, replaced by a sharp, intense focus. He did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. He asked a simple, practical question. "Where was the stain?" "Near the door," she said, as if he stumbled in or was dragged. "And the men who brought him back, Jed and Colby, they work for Blackwood whenever he needs extra muscle." Caleb absorbed this information without comment, but Alara saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was a scout, a man who saw what others missed. He was putting the pieces together, seeing the shape of the truth she had only just begun to suspect. "Blackwood wanted our land," she confessed, the words pouring out of her now that the dam had broken. "The spring never freezes. He made offers. Thomas always said no. The week before he died, Thomas told me Blackwood had threatened him. Thomas laughed it off. He was strong, but he was too trusting." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading for she wasn't sure what. Absolution? Confirmation of her fears. Caleb's expression was grim. He had seen the ugliness of men on the battlefield, and he recognized its shape here in the quiet, grasping evil of a man like Silas Blackwood. He was looking at her not as a grieving widow, but as a fellow survivor of a different kind of war. "You are not a trusting man," she stated, a realization dawning on her. "The world has a way of beating trust out of you," he said quietly. He looked from her to the sleeping child and then around the cabin, his fortress against that world. But sometimes, he added, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it, "it leaves something else in its place." He didn't say what that something else was. He didn't have to. Alara knew. It was strength. It was vigilance. It was the fierce, unwavering will to protect the small, quiet things that mattered. In the warm, firelit cabin, surrounded by the fury of the storm, two broken people sat in the wreckage of their pasts and saw, for the first time, the possibility of a future. They were not whole, and they might never be, but they were survivors. And in this harsh, unforgiving world, that was more than enough. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind's relentless howl subsided to a mournful sigh, and a strange, bright silence descended upon the mountain. Alara woke to a world transformed. The single window of the cabin was no longer a portal to a gray, swirling chaos, but a frame for a scene of breathtaking, brutal beauty. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor, struck the fresh snow with a blinding intensity, making the entire landscape glitter as if it were dusted with diamonds. Every tree branch was heavy with a thick blanket of white, and the jagged peaks of the obsidian range stood sharp and clear against a sky of impossible blue. It was a clean, new world, washed of all its imperfections. But the beauty was deceptive. It was the beauty of a perfectly honed blade, cold and dangerous. The new snow, Caleb had explained, would have buried the old trails, hidden crevasses, and made travel treacherous for anyone who did not know the mountain's secrets. The blizzard had not just been a storm, it had been a reinforcement. Their fortress was more secure than ever. The breaking of the storm, however, brought a new kind of tension. The immediate, existential threat was gone, but its absence only served to highlight the larger, more human threat that remained. Down in Redemption Gap, Silas Blackwood was waiting. He would be watching the mountain, waiting for a sign, waiting for them to fail. The knowledge settled in the quiet spaces between them. They had found a fragile peace in their isolation, but it was a temporary reprieve. The world would not leave them alone. One morning, about a week after the storm had passed, Caleb returned from his daily patrol of the perimeter, his expression grimmer than usual. He carried a fresh rabbit for the stew pot, but his focus was elsewhere. He unstrapped a pair of snowshoes by the door and walked to the wall where his rifle hung. "We have a visitor," he announced, his voice flat. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. "Blackwood?" "No, not his tracks." He took the rifle down and began the familiar, meticulous process of cleaning and oiling it, even though it was already immaculate. It was a ritual, a way of focusing his mind. One man, coming up the old trapper's path on the north face. He's good, uses the terrain for cover, but he's not from the mountain. "Who is it?" Alara asked, her voice a tight whisper. She moved instinctively to stand where she could see Lily, who was playing quietly by the hearth with her wooden bird. "Don't know," Caleb said, not looking up from his work. "But no one comes up here without a reason. And there are only two reasons to come to this place: to seek refuge, or to bring trouble." He slid the bolt of the rifle back and forth. The metallic click was a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet cabin. He doesn't look like he's seeking refuge. The waiting was the worst part. An hour stretched into two. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Alara tried to go about her morning chores, but her hands trembled. Every snap of a twig outside, every cry of a raven, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Caleb was a study in stillness. He sat on a stool by the window, the rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on a point down the slope that was invisible to Alara. He was not tense. He was coiled, a predator waiting with absolute patience for its prey to reveal itself. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "He's here." Alara's breath hitched. She peered over his shoulder, but saw nothing but snow and trees. "Stay away from the window," Caleb commanded, his voice sharp. "And keep the child quiet." Alara scooped Lily into her arms and retreated to the far corner of the cabin, her own body a shield for her sister's. She whispered a story into Lily's ear, her voice strained, her heart hammering against her ribs. A voice called out from the trees, thin and reedy in the vast emptiness. "Hello, the cabin. I'm a friend." Caleb did not move a muscle. His eyes remained fixed on the woods. "Got a message for the lady of the house," the voice called again, closer this time. From town, a man emerged from the tree lean, his hands held high to show they were empty. He was a wiry, nervous-looking man with a ferret-like face and shifty eyes. Alara recognized him. His name was Ben, and he ran a small livery stable on the edge of town. He was a man who survived by keeping his head down and his opinions to himself. For him, to come all this way meant the message was important, or the payment was very good. "That's far enough, Ben." Caleb's voice boomed, startlingly loud. He hadn't raised his voice, but it seemed to carry on the cold, clear air with the weight of a boulder. Ben froze in his tracks, his eyes wide with fear as he located Caleb in the shadowy darkness of the window. "Caleb," he stammered, "I ain't here for trouble. I swear. I got a message." "From who?" Caleb's tone was flat, uncompromising. I can't say." "Then you've wasted a trip," Caleb said, and there was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the way he held the rifle. Panic flashed across Ben's face. "Wait, it's for her," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger towards the cabin. "From Mr. Blackwood." The name hung in the air like a disease. "He knows you're alive," Ben rushed on, the words tumbling out of him. "The whole town does. They saw the smoke from your chimney after the storm." Blackwood's, he's not happy. He says the deal is off. He says the mountain man stole his property. I'm not property. Alara's voice rang out, sharp and clear. She had stepped away from the corner, Lily still in her arms, her face a mask of cold fury. Ben flinched as if she had struck him. No, ma'am. Of course not. But that's what he's saying. He's telling everyone you were taken against your will. He's deputized a posse. 10 men. Hard men. They're coming. He says they're coming to rescue you. A rescue. The word was a bitter mockery. It was an invasion force sanctioned by a lie. When Caleb's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Soon, Ben whispered, his eyes darting nervously back towards the path he had taken. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day. As soon as they think the pass is clear enough. He told me to tell you. He told me to tell the lady that if she comes down now, alone, he'll be merciful. But if his men have to come up and get her, he can't be held responsible for what might happen. To her, or the girl. Or to you, Caleb. It was a threat and an ultimatum delivered by a terrified messenger. Blackwood was not just going to wait for them to fail. He was going to be the instrument of their failure. He was going to use the guise of the law and chivalry to commit murder and theft. He gave me this for my trouble, Ben added, pulling a small, heavy pouch from his coat and throwing it onto the snow. It landed with a soft chink of coins. I don't want it. He backed away, his hands raised again. I've delivered the message. I'm done. I never saw nothing. I don't know nothing. With that, he turned and scrambled back into the woods, half running, half falling in his haste to get away. Silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. The beautiful, sunlit day suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. The enemy was no longer a vague and distant threat. He had a name, a number, and a direction. They were coming. Alara's legs felt weak. She sank onto a stool, pulling Lily onto her lap, burying her face in the child's soft hair. The fragile peace they had built was about to be shattered. The world was coming to their door, and it was bringing guns and torches. She looked at Caleb. He was no longer looking out the window. He was looking at her, his storm-gray eyes holding an expression she had not seen before. It was not fear. It was a cold, calculated rage. The rage of a man whose sanctuary was about to be violated. The protective fury of a creature whose den was being threatened. He walked to the center of the room, the rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not a hermit hiding from the world anymore. He was a soldier who had just received his orders. He thinks 10 men are enough, Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He is a fool. He turned his gaze from Alara to the cabin itself, his eyes sweeping over the walls, the door, the single window. He was not seeing a home. He was seeing a battlefield. We have work to do, he said. The hours that followed were a blur of focused, frantic activity. The quiet, domestic rhythm of the cabin was replaced by the grim, urgent cadence of fortification. Caleb was transformed. The taciturn, watchful hermit was gone, replaced by the scout he had once been, a man who understood terrain, tactics, and the brutal mathematics of violence. The cabin is our only defensible position, he stated, his voice crisp and authoritative. He was pacing the small room, his prosthetic leg making a steady, rhythmic thud on the floorboards, a sound like a war drum. They will have to come up the south face, single file. It's their only approach. That's our kill zone. Alara listened, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her mind sharp and clear. The time for terror was over. Now is the time for survival. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady. Caleb stopped pacing and looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw not a frightened widow, but a partner, a soldier. First, water, he commanded. Every bucket, every pot, fill them. Melt snow. If the fight is long, we can't risk going outside. While Alara and a wide-eyed, but silent Lily hauled in buckets of snow and set them near the fire to melt, Caleb worked on the cabin itself. He used an auger to drill small, fist-sized holes in the log walls at varying heights. Gun ports, he explained, not breaking his rhythm, so we can fire without exposing ourselves at the window. He took down the heavy wooden table and wedged it against the inside of the door, reinforcing it. He stacked their remaining firewood against the lower half of the large window, creating a crude but effective barricade that still allowed a clear line of sight over the top. The cabin was slowly being transformed from a home into a bunker. When the physical preparations were done, he turned his attention to her. He took the long rifle from the wall, the one he had been oiling earlier. It was a beautiful, deadly piece of craftsmanship. He held out to her. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "Thomas taught me a little," she admitted, "with an old squirrel gun. I'm not very good." "You will be," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. He led her through the mechanics of the weapon. His hands, large and scarred, guided hers, showing her how to hold the heavy stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly without jerking. His proximity was overwhelming, the scent of pine and cold air a familiar comfort. But his focus was entirely on the task at hand. There was no gentleness in his instruction now, only a stark, demanding efficiency. "This is not a toy," he said, his voice a low growl in her ear. "Every shot must have a purpose. Don't shoot at shadows. Don't shoot at sounds. You shoot when you see a man. You aim for the center of his chest. You do not hesitate. Do you understand?" "Yes," she whispered, the cold, heavy weight of the rifle a terrible reality in her hands. "Show me." He pointed to a knot on a distant pine tree, visible through the open doorway. "That is your target. Load." Her fingers fumbled with the cartridge, but she managed to slide it into the chamber. She raised the rifle. It was heavier than she remembered, and her arms trembled. She nestled the stock in her shoulder, took a deep breath as he had shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil a brutal punch to her shoulder that sent her stumbling backward. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of snow a dozen feet from the target. "Again," Caleb said, his voice impassive. They spent the next hour like that. Alara loaded and fired, until her shoulder was a bruised, throbbing ache, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. Her shots were wild at first, but slowly, under his terse corrections, "Breathe out before you squeeze, elbows tight, follow through," she began to find her rhythm. Her trembling subsided, replaced by a cold focus. She began to hit the tree. Not just the tree, but the knot itself. Finally, Caleb took the rifle from her. "Good enough," he said. It was the highest praise she had ever heard from him. He then produced a smaller weapon, a heavy, snub-nosed pistol. "This was my brother's," he said, his voice softening for a fraction of a second. "Keep it with you. Always. It's for close work. If they get inside." The words, "if they get inside," hung in the air, a chilling possibility. He showed her how to load and fire it, the action much simpler than the rifles. The pistol felt heavy and solid in her hand, a dark promise. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, a grim quiet settled over the cabin. The preparations were complete. All that was left was to wait. Caleb gave Alara and Lily the sleeping platform, the most protected part of the cabin, away from the door and window. He took up his familiar position on the floor by the main entrance, his rifle across his lap. Alara lay on the furs, Lily curled sleeping beside her, but sleep was an impossible luxury. Her mind raced, replaying Caleb's instructions, the feel of the rifle but against her shoulder, the acrid smell of gunpowder. She was a different woman from the one who had trembled before Silas Blackwood in the town hall. Fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was a whetstone, sharpening her senses, honing her resolve. She looked over at the dark silhouette of the man by the door. He was more than just a protector. He was a teacher. He had not coddled her or hidden her from the coming violence. He had armed her. He had trained her. He had made her a participant in her own salvation. He had shown her respect that Thomas, in his loving but conventional way, never had. He saw her not as something to be sheltered, but as a fellow warrior. In the deep, cold silence of the mountain night, a profound and terrible understanding bloomed in her heart. She was not just fighting for her life or for Lily's. She was fighting for this man, for this place, for the fragile, fierce thing they had built together in the heart of the storm. Caleb, she whispered into the darkness. His silhouette shifted. I am here. When they come, she started, her voice trembling slightly. I will be with you, he finished, his voice a solemn vow in the darkness. It was all she needed to hear. She closed her eyes, the cold, heavy weight of the pistol under her pillow a strange and terrible comfort, and waited for the dawn. The attack came just after sunrise. The world was cold and gray, the air still and heavy with anticipation. Caleb had been awake all night, a motionless sentinel, but as the first weak light of dawn filtered through the trees, he became animated. They're coming, he said, his voice a low growl. He had seen something, a flicker of movement, a disturbance in the pattern of the woods, that was invisible to Alara's untrained eye. Alara's heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She moved quickly, her actions driven by the muscle memory of the previous day's drills. She checked on Lily, who was still asleep, cocooned in a nest of furs in the safest corner of the cabin. She moved to the gun port Caleb had assigned her, the heavy rifle feeling cold and alien in her hands. The silence stretched, taut, and unbearable. Then she saw them, 10 figures, dark against the snow, moving slowly and cautiously up the slope. They were still far off, mere specks in the distance, but their intent was unmistakable. They moved like a pack of wolves, spreading out, using the trees for cover. Hold your fire, Caleb commanded, his voice a calm anchor in the swirling sea of Alara's fear. Let them get closer. Let them get tired. The mountain will do half the work for us. The climb was steep and the snow was deep. The men slipped and slid, cursing as they hauled themselves upward. They were city men, hired guns, out of their element in this vertical wilderness. Alara could see their faces now, hard, cruel faces she recognized from Blackwood Saloon. At their lead was a big, bull-necked man named Harker, Blackwood's chief enforcer. They stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, gathering behind a small outcropping of rock. Caleb, Harker's voice boomed across the snow, arrogant and full of contempt. Blackwood wants the woman and the girl. Send them out now, and he might let you live, you damn cripple. Caleb did not answer. He simply raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The shot was not aimed at Harker. It was aimed at the snowbank just above his head. The crack of the rifle was followed by a deep whoosh as a massive slab of snow and ice broke free and cascaded down, burying 2 of the more exposed men in a white torrent. It was a warning shot, a demonstration of power. It said, "This is my mountain. You're trespassers here." Panic erupted among the remaining men. They scrambled for cover, firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls like angry hornets. One found the window, shattering the glass and sending a spray of icy air and shards into the room. "Now," Caleb said, his voice cold as the grave. The cabin erupted in violence. Caleb fired from the main window, a steady, methodical rhythm of death. Load, aim, fire. Each shot was a punctuation mark in the unfolding chaos. A man who broke cover to get a better angle crumpled and fell, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Another tried to circle around the side, was thrown backward as if by an invisible hand. Caleb was not a man anymore. He was a force of nature, as deadly and impersonal as the avalanche he had summoned. He moved with a lethal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. The one-legged cripple the town mocked was a master of his domain, a king in his castle of wood and stone. Alara, watching from her gun port, felt a surge of something hot and fierce. It was not just fear, but rage. These men had come to her home. They had threatened her child. They had come to destroy the one place she had ever felt safe. She raised her own rifle, the stock pressed tight against her bruised shoulder. She found a man in her sights, one who was trying to reload behind a thin birch tree. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She remembered Caleb's words, "Aim for the center. Do not hesitate." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but this time she was ready for it. Through the smoke, she saw the man jolt, drop his gun, and slide down into the snow. He did not get back up. A wave of nausea and a strange, exhilarating sense of power washed over her in equal measure. She had taken a life. She had defended her home. The two thoughts were inseparable, a terrible and liberating truth. She reloaded, her movements automatic, and found another target. The battle raged. Two of the attackers, bolder and stupider than the rest, made a mad dash for the door, hoping to break it down with their sheer mass. Caleb left the window to Alara and moved to intercept them. He braced his good leg, and as the first man slammed his shoulder against the wood, Caleb fired his pistol through one of the gun ports at point-blank range. The man screamed and fell back. The second man, enraged, managed to get an axe and began hacking at the door. Wood splintered. The barricade groaned. "Alara!" Caleb shouted. "The window!" Alara turned her rifle on the man at the door, but her angle was bad. She couldn't get a clear shot. The door was beginning to give way. The heavy table shrieked as it was pushed inward. The man's face, contorted with rage, appeared in the growing gap. In that moment, Lily, woken by the gunfire, let out a terrified scream. Something snapped inside Alara. The protective fury Caleb had shown on the mountain was a pale shadow compared to the volcanic rage of a mother defending her child. She dropped the rifle, useless at this range. She pulled the heavy pistol from her waistband, the one Caleb had given her. It felt like an anchor in her hand. She stepped into the center of the room, planted her feet, raised the pistol with both hands as he had shown her, and fired. The man in the doorway stared at her, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A red flower bloomed on his shirt. He looked down at it, confused, and then his legs gave out, and he collapsed, half in and half out of the cabin, his body jamming the broken door. Silence. The sudden lack of gunfire was more shocking than the noise had been. Alara stood, smoke curling from the barrel of the pistol, her ears ringing, her body trembling. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice ragged. Caleb was already moving. He shoved the dead man's body out of the doorway and peered cautiously outside. "For now," he said grimly. "They're pulling back, but they're not gone." He turned to look at her, his eyes taking in the pistol still clutched in her hand, the fierce, defiant set of her jaw. The violation was complete. The sanctuary had been breached, the home desecrated by violence. But in the midst of the wreckage, the splintered door, the shattered window, the smell of blood and gunpowder, something new had been forged. Alara was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a fighter. She had met the violence of the world with violence of her own, and she had not been found wanting. Caleb's gaze softened. He crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took the pistol from her unresisting fingers. His hand closed over hers, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding. He had seen her kill a man, and he was not horrified. He was proud. "You saved us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You saved me." But the moment of connection was shattered by a new sound. A scraping, scratching sound from the back of the cabin. And then the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke. Something acrid and greasy. "Fire," Caleb hissed, spinning around. While they had been focused on the front, one of the attackers had crept around to the back and thrown a torch against the dry log wall. Flames were beginning to lick their way up the side of the cabin, eating away at their fortress from the inside out. They were trapped. The enemy was in front of them, and a fire was behind them. Blackwood's men didn't have to get in anymore. They just had to wait for the cabin to burn down around them. The fire was a living thing, a hungry beast gnawing at the bones of their home. Smoke, thick and oily, began to pour through the gaps in the log walls, filling the cabin with a choking haze. The crackle of the flames was a terrifying counterpoint to the ringing silence outside. The remaining attackers were being patient, letting the fire do their work for them. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way back into Alara's heart, but she beat it down. She looked at Caleb. His face was grim, smudged with soot, but his eyes were clear and focused. He was not defeated. He was calculating. "Lily," Alara cried, rushing to her sister. She scooped the coughing, terrified child into her arms, pressing a damp cloth Caleb had thrust at her over Lily's face. "We can't stay here," Caleb stated, the brutal truth undeniable. "We have to go through them." It was a suicide mission. To leave the relative safety of the cabin meant exposing themselves on the open snow, with at least 4 or 5 gunmen waiting for them. "They won't expect it," Caleb continued, his mind already working out the tactics. "They think we're trapped. They think we'll burn. We use their assumptions against them." He moved with a desperate urgency, grabbing a thick bearskin from the sleeping platform. "When I give the word, you run. You run straight for the tree line to the north. Don't look back. Don't stop, no matter what you hear. Just run. Do you understand?" "What about you?" she cried, her voice full of dread. He was talking as if he wasn't coming with them. "I will be right behind you," he said, but his eyes told a different story. He was planning to be the distraction, the rearguard, the sacrifice. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "No, we leave together, or we don't leave at all." For a heart-stopping second, they stared at each other, a silent battle of wills waged in the flickering, smoke-filled air. His instinct was to protect her by sacrificing himself. Hers was to refuse a salvation that cost him his life. A flicker of something that looked like admiration, or perhaps just grim acceptance, passed through his eyes. Together, then, he conceded, "Stay behind me." He kicked away the smoldering remnants of the barricade at the door, creating a clear exit. He took a deep breath, the rifle held ready. He glanced at her one last time, a look that said everything words could not. Then he bellowed a raw, primal war cry, a sound that was pure, untamed wilderness, and burst through the doorway. The world outside exploded in a cacophony of shouts and gunfire. Caleb, a terrifying apparition of smoke and fury, charged not towards the safety of the woods, but directly at the main group of attackers, who were clustered behind their rocky outcropping. He fired from the hip, his movements a blur of savage grace. It was the last thing they expected. They were prepared for frightened refugees fleeing a fire, not a one-man army charging them head-on. They were confused, their shots going wide. This was Alara's chance. Clutching Lily tight to her chest, she ran. She followed the path Caleb had laid out, her feet sinking into the deep snow, her lungs burning from the smoke and the cold air. She did not look back. She trusted him. But then, a shout from behind made her blood run cold. "Harker! It's a trick! The woman is getting away." She risked a glance over her shoulder. Caleb was a whirlwind of violence, having already taken down one more man, but Harker, the leader, had seen her. He was ignoring Caleb now, raising his own rifle, taking careful aim at her and the child on her back. Tom seemed to slow down. She saw the puff of smoke from his rifle barrel an instant before she heard the crack. She felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through her left arm. The impact spun her around, and she fell, her body a shield over Lily as they tumbled into the snow. The pain was blinding, a fire that consumed her entire arm. But through the red haze, she saw Caleb. He had seen her fall. He had seen Harker take aim at her. And in his eyes was a look of such pure, protective fury that it was more terrifying than any fire or any army of men. He let out a roar of rage and pain, her pain, and charged Harker. He no longer bothered with the rifle. He threw it aside. This was personal. He closed the distance between them with a speed that was inhuman, his prosthetic leg churning through the snow. Harker, a big, confident man, brought his rifle up to use as a club. He swung it at Caleb's head. Caleb ducked under the blow, his powerful shoulders slamming into Harker's midsection. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the blood-stained snow. Alara struggled to her feet, her left arm hanging useless and numb at her side. Lily was crying, terrified but unharmed. Alara knew she should run, get Lily to safety as Caleb had ordered. But she couldn't. She was mesmerized by the brutal ballet taking place before her. Caleb was a grizzly, and Harker was a bull. They wrestled in the snow, trading blows, grunting with effort. But Caleb was fighting with more than just muscle. He was fighting with a righteous rage that Harker, a man who fought only for money, could not comprehend. Caleb got the upper hand, his scarred hands closing around Harker's throat. But Harker was slippery. He managed to get a hand free and pulled a long knife from his boot. He plunged it deep into Caleb's thigh, his good leg. Caleb cried out a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and his grip loosened. Harker rolled away, scrambling to his feet, the bloody knife in his hand. Caleb tried to rise, but his leg gave out, and he fell back onto one knee, his face a mask of agony. "Had enough, cripple," Harker snarled. Advancing on him, the knife held ready. "I'm going to carve you up and feed you to the crows. And then I'm going to take my time with the woman." He never got the chance. Alara, seeing Caleb fall, seeing the knife, seeing the triumphant leer on Harker's face, did not think. She acted. She pushed Lily behind her. "Stay here," she commanded. She pulled the pistol from her waistband. It was her last shot. She had one bullet left. Harker was standing over Caleb, his back to her, raising the knife for the final, killing blow. "Harker!" she screamed. He turned, a look of annoyance on his face that quickly turned to shock as he saw the pistol in her hand. She did not aim for the center of his chest. She did not have time. She aimed for the man who had hurt her family, who had tried to kill her child, who was about to murder the man she. The thought completed itself in the same instant she fired the gun. The man she loved. The bullet struck Harker square in the chest. He staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the new, dark stains spreading across his shirt, then back at her. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he fell, his face planting in the snow, and was still. The remaining two henchmen, who had been watching the duel from a distance, saw their leader fall. They saw the wild man on the ground, wounded but alive. They saw the woman, standing over him with a smoking pistol, her face a mask of terrible resolve. They looked at each other, and without a word, they turned and fled, disappearing back down the mountain. Silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning cabin and Lily's soft sobs. Alara dropped the pistol. The strength that had held her up drained away, and she collapsed to her knees, the pain in her arm returning with a vengeance. She crawled through the snow to Caleb. He was still on one knee, his head bowed, his hand pressed against the deep knife wound in his thigh. Blood oozed between his fingers. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice breaking. He looked up, his face pale, his breathing ragged. But he was alive. His storm-gray eyes found hers, and in them she saw not just gratitude, but a raw, aching vulnerability she had never seen before. She reached out with her good hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of a scar. "It's over," she said, the tears she had held back for so long finally falling, freezing on her cheeks. "It's over." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. "Alara," he breathed her name like a prayer. They were a broken, bleeding mess in a field of snow and blood, their home a pyre behind them. They had lost everything. But as she knelt beside him, his head resting against her shoulder, his ragged breath warm against her neck, Alara knew that they had won. They had won each other. The immediate aftermath was a blur of pain and grim necessity. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the fight drained away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion and the stark reality of their situation. Their home was a smoking ruin. They were both wounded, and they were stranded on a mountain with a terrified child and the temperature dropping as the sun began to set. Caleb, despite the deep knife wound in his thigh, was the first to rally. The soldier in him took over. "The fire will keep the wolves away," he grunted, forcing himself to his feet. He swayed, his face pale, but he refused to fall. "We need shelter, and we need to stop the bleeding." Alara, her own arm a throbbing agony, nodded. She tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat with her teeth and her good hand, fashioning a crude sling to immobilize her wounded arm. The bullet had passed clean through the fleshy part of her upper arm, a fact for which she was profoundly grateful. It was painful, but not life-threatening. Caleb's wound was more serious. The knife had gone deep, and blood was still welling from it, staining the snow a sickening crimson. The old trapper's lean-to, he said through gritted teeth, pointing toward a ridge a few hundred yards away. It's sheltered. We can make it. The journey was a nightmare. Caleb leaned heavily on a sturdy branch he used as a crutch, his prosthetic leg a hindrance now on the uneven ground. Alara, carrying a whimpering Lily on her back, helped to support him on his other side. Every step was an agony for both of them. They were a three-legged, four-armed creature, stumbling through the snow, leaving a trail of blood behind them. The lean-to was little more than a shallow cave, improved with a low wall of rocks and a roof of pine boughs. It was cramped and smelled of damp earth, but it was shelter from the wind. Caleb collapsed inside, his face ashen. The fire, he gasped. We need fire. While Alara gathered what dry tinder she could find nearby, her mind a frantic prayer that it would be enough, Caleb showed her a hidden cache inside the lean-to. It contained a small, waterproof pouch with flint and steel, a handful of dried meat, and, most importantly, a small tin of medicinal salve. My father's, he murmured, his voice weak, as she helped him pull the pouch from the hiding place. He was a doctor of a sort. Building the fire with one hand while her teeth chattered from cold and shock was the hardest thing Alara had ever done. But finally, a tiny flame caught, and she nurtured it with the care of a new mother, until it grew into a small, cheerful blaze that pushed back the encroaching darkness and cold. The next task was their wounds. Caleb guided her through it, his voice quiet but firm, the scout and the doctor's son taking over. She cleaned his thigh wound with snow, then packed it with the pungent, herbal salve from the tin. She tore more strips from her petticoat to bandage it tightly, her movements clumsy but effective. Then it was her turn. He directed her on how to clean her own wound, how to apply the salve. The pain was immense, but the warmth of the fire and the focus of the task kept the darkness at bay. Finally, they were done. They huddled together near the fire, Lily sleeping fitfully between them, wrapped in the bearskin cloak Caleb had insisted they salvage from the burning cabin. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the quiet of shared survival, of profound and utter exhaustion. They sat that way for a long time, watching the flames dance. The bodies of the fallen men were out there in the darkness, a grim reminder of the price of their peace. Silas Blackwood's power over Redemption Gap was broken, his hired guns dead or scattered. The physical threat was gone. But as the night wore on, a new, more subtle tension began to build. The crisis was over. The common enemy that had forged them into a unit was defeated, and now a choice loomed. Caleb was a loner, a hermit. He had built a fortress on this mountain to keep the world out. Alara and Lily had breached its walls, first as burdens, then as allies. But where were they now? As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of pink and gray, Alara saw him stirring. He was testing his wounded leg, his face tight with pain. She saw him glance at his pack, at the few meager possessions he had. The look in his eyes was one she recognized. It was the look of a wild creature, healed enough to move on, ready to return to the solitude of its own territory. His duty was done. He had protected them, as he had vowed. He had saved their lives, and they had saved his. The debt was paid. In his mind, she realized with a sinking heart, there was nothing left to keep him here. He would see them safely down the mountain, and then he would disappear back into the wilderness, a ghost, a myth once more. The thought was a physical pain, sharper than the bullet wound in her arm. The idea of a future without his quiet presence, his stormy eyes, his gruff kindness, was a bleak and empty landscape. She had faced down armed men, killed to protect her family, and survived a fire, but the thought of him leaving, that was the thing that truly terrified her. He caught her watching him, and a familiar, guarded look came over his face. He was already building the wall again, retreating back into himself. When we have our strength back, he said, his voice carefully neutral, I will take you and the child down to the town. Your claim to the land is secure now. Blackwood won't trouble you again. He was already talking about her future as if it did not include him. He was letting her go. The old Alara, the timid, frightened widow from Redemption Gap, would have accepted this. She would have nodded, whispered her thanks, and let him walk away, leaving a gaping hole in her life. But she was not that woman anymore. The mountain, the storm, the fire, and the love for this broken, noble man had forged her into something new, something stronger, something that knew what it wanted and was no longer afraid to fight for it. She would not let him go without a fight. The last embers of their small fire were fading as the sun climbed above the ridge, flooding their makeshift shelter with a cold, clear light. The new day brought with it the stark reality of their crossroads. Caleb had already packed his few salvage belongings into a small bundle. He moved stiffly, the pain in his leg evident in every motion, but his intent was clear. He was preparing to leave. Not just the lean-to, but her life. Alara watched him, her heart a tangled knot of love and fear. She had faced death and hadn't flinched, but the prospect of this quiet, final farewell felt like a far greater wound. She thought of the life that awaited her down in Redemption Gap, a life of quiet solitude, of raising Lily on the land she had fought for. It was a good life, a peaceful life. But without him, it felt incomplete. It felt empty. He finished his preparations and turned to her. His face was a stoic mask, but she could see the conflict in his eyes, the deep-seated loneliness warring with a lifetime of self-imposed isolation. "The path down will be clear by midday," he said, his voice the familiar, gravelly rumble that had become the soundtrack to her survival. "We should rest until then." It was a dismissal, a gentle but firm closing of a door, and Alara decided she would not let him close it. She stood up, her own movements stiff and painful, and walked towards him. She stopped just before him, forcing him to look at her, to truly see her. She was not the helpless creature he had found in the town hall. Her clothes were torn and blood-stained. Her face was smudged with soot. Her arm was in a crude sling, but her eyes were clear and her chin was high. She was a queen in her own right, forged in the fires of his mountain. "You once told me that on this mountain your name meant something," she began, her voice quiet but ringing with an unshakable resolve. "You said it meant I was under your protection." He nodded slowly, his gaze wary. "That's right. You gave me your name, Caleb," she continued, taking a step closer. "In that town hall, in front of all those men, you bound yourself to me. It was a mockery to them, a joke. But you told me you didn't take Blackwood's deal. You made your own." "I did," he admitted, his voice rough. "Then the deal is not done," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You promised me your protection. You promised me your name. You can't just take it back. A deal is a deal." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "But the danger is past. Blackwood is finished. You are safe." "Am I?" she challenged, her eyes locking with his. "You think Blackwood was the only danger? What about the winter, Caleb? What about the loneliness? What about a lifetime of looking over my shoulder? You think one fight solves all that?" She reached out with her good hand and laid it on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "You are a man of honor. I have seen it. You keep your promises. You promised me and Lily your protection. Our home is gone. We have nowhere to go." His eyes softened with a familiar, weary sadness. "I will help you rebuild," he offered. "I will chop the wood. I will hunt for you until you are settled." "That's not the deal," she said fiercely, her fingers curling into the rough fabric of his shirt. "That's charity. I am not a charity case. I am your wife." The word, wife, hung in the air between them, bold and shocking and undeniably true. "Alara," he started, his voice full of anguish. He tried to turn away, to retreat behind his walls, but she would not let him. "No," she commanded, her voice breaking with the force of her emotion. "You will listen to me. I am not asking you to be my hired hand. I am not asking you to be my neighbor. I am asking you to be my husband, to be Lily's father, to build a new home with us. Not down in the valley, but here, on this mountain, our mountain." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. This was not a plea from a place of weakness, but a declaration from a place of strength. "I know you're a loner. I know you think you are a monster, a broken thing that doesn't belong in the world. But you are wrong. You are the strongest, most honorable man I have ever known. You are not broken, Caleb. You are beautiful. She saw his control shatter. The stoic mask crumbled, and for the first time, she saw the raw, aching heart of the man beneath. She saw the boy who had lost his leg at Gettysburg, the man who had retreated from the world's cruelty, the lonely soul who had forgotten what it felt like to be loved. "This is your home now," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "We are your home. Please, Caleb, stay. Stay with us." He looked from her face, so full of fierce, unwavering love, to Lily, who was now awake and watching them with wide, curious eyes. He looked around at the sun-drenched peaks of the mountain range that had been his prison and his sanctuary. For a lifetime, he had been solitary. He had defined himself by his isolation, by his otherness. He was the mountain man, the hermit, the cripple. He was a man apart. To stay meant letting go of that identity. It meant accepting a new one: husband, father, protector. It meant choosing connection over solitude, warmth over cold, hope over despair. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his large, callous palm engulfing her fingers. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a gesture of infinite tenderness. He did not speak. He did not need to. His answer was in the way he leaned down and, for the first time, gently, reverently, pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not a fiery, passionate explosion. It was something quieter and far more profound. It tasted of wood smoke and winter and the faint, metallic tang of blood. It was a kiss of shared sorrows and hard-won victories. It was a promise. It was a homecoming. When he pulled back, his storm-gray eyes were clear, the ghosts of the past finally banished by the light of the present. He looked at her, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips, transforming his scarred and rugged face into something breathtakingly handsome. He did not say, "I will stay." He did not say, "I love you." He said, "We will need more logs for the new cabin. Stronger ones this time." And Alara, her heart so full it felt it might burst, laughed through her tears. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. They did not go down to the valley that day. They did not go down for a long, long time. They stayed on their mountain, and they began to rebuild. Together. By the time the first snows of the next winter began to fall, a new cabin stood in the clearing, stronger and more secure than the first, with a curl of smoke rising from its chimney like a flag of victory. They had been given to each other as a punishment, a cruel joke by a petty tyrant. But from the ashes of humiliation and violence, they had forged a kingdom. And in the heart of the unforgiving mountains, the one-legged mountain man, his fierce wife, and their daughter finally had a home. They owned the valley, not by deed or by title, but by the simple, unassailable fact that they had fought for it, bled for it, and chosen it. And it had chosen them back.